Lot 118. A woman's dining set, her wedding china, 2 boxes of photographs, a folded flag in a triangular case, and a hand-cranked sewing machine that still worked. Hammer price, $400. Lot 119. A man's tools, his tackle boxes, and the workbench he built the year his daughter was born. Hammer price, $225. Lot 120. 61 years of one household, sold in a single carton marked miscellaneous. Hammer price, $11. Here is the part that should make your jaw tighten. Every person I just described was alive on the day their things went across that auction block. Alive and legally unable to stop it, because a court had signed one piece of paper about each of them. I'm Nathan, and I spend a lot of my time reading the boring documents that ruin people's lives, because the interesting documents almost never do. This story starts with a soldier stepping off a bus after 11 months away and finding his son's bedroom stripped down to the bare floorboards. It ends with a garage door going up on the single most humiliating morning of a woman's life. In between, you're going to learn how a small group of people in one county turned other human beings into inventory, how a very ordinary 8-year-old with a $19 camera did more real investigative work than anyone with a badge, and how his father took the whole thing apart with one phone call to a person you have never once thought about. Stay with the numbers in this one. The numbers are where he wins. Sergeant First Class Carson Steadham had spent 11 months of his life making sure that other people's sons came home with their names spelled right. That is not a figure of speech. It was his job description. Carson was a 92 Mike, mortuary affairs, and for the length of that deployment, he ran a detachment inside the personal effects depot at Camp Arifjan, Kuwait. When an American died downrange, everything that had been on that person, or near that person, came to Carson in a sealed container. A watch, a wallet with a movie stub still in it, a paperback with the corner folded down on page 91, which meant that somebody had intended to keep reading. Boots, a phone, a ring on a bootlace because it wouldn't fit over a swollen knuckle in that heat. Carson's people photographed every item on a white background with a scale card and a case number. They logged it, they cleaned what could be cleaned, and they made a judgment call on what should not be cleaned, because sometimes a family wants the dust. They packed it, and they signed a chain of custody form that had a line for every hand the property passed through. And then they called a stranger on the phone and told that stranger their whole life was arriving on Tuesday. In 11 months, Carson's detachment processed 1,140 cases. He knew that number the way you know your own birthday. He also knew, because he had counted, that he had discharged his weapon exactly 41 times during that deployment, and that all 41 had happened on a range, at paper. He was not a killer. He had spent almost 2 decades being the opposite of a killer, professionally, for people who could no longer complain about the service. The bus dropped him at the transportation office at Fort Campbell at 4:20 in the afternoon on a Thursday in September, and there was no one there for him. He told himself the road from Bagwell was bad that time of day. He told himself Geneva had probably taken Walt to the dentist and lost track. He signed his hand receipt, took his duffel, and got a ride out to the lot where his truck had been parked for 11 months. And the truck started on the second try, which he took as a good sign, because at that point, he was still a man who looked for good signs. He turned onto Ridgemont at 5:05 and saw his house, and knew something was wrong before he could have told you what it was, and the reason he knew is professional. Carson had spent 11 months looking at rooms and containers and reading them. A house that people live in has a signature. Trash can at the curb on the wrong day. A bicycle laid on its side instead of on its stand. Curtains at the same height in every window. His curtains were all pulled to exactly the same height. Nobody does that. His key didn't work in the front door. He stood there for a while with the key in his hand, and then he walked around the side, and the back door key didn't work either, and the deadbolt was new, and the brass was bright enough that it had been installed inside the last 2 weeks. He broke a pane in the utility room door with the heel of his hand wrapped in his blouse, because the alternative was standing in his own yard until dark. The house was empty. Not emptied the way a family empties a house when it moves. Emptied. The living room had a folding chair in it and nothing else. There were bright rectangles on the walls where the frames had been, and a single wall anchor still in the drywall at picture height. The kitchen had a plate, a fork, and a coffee cup in the sink, all of them dry, which told him nobody had run water in that sink for at least 3 days. The refrigerator was unplugged with the door propped open by a rolled towel, which is what a careful person does, and Geneva had always been careful. He went upstairs to his son's room last, because part of him already knew. Walt's room had been stripped to the floorboards. Not cleared, stripped. The bed, the dresser, the beanbag chair, the 12-inch shelf Carson had put up himself with a laser level while Walt held the pencil, all gone. The closet rod was gone. The closet door was gone, off its hinges and all. The baseboards had been pried off, and the carpet had been pulled up along with the tack strips, and the tack strips had left their little nail scars all around the perimeter of the subfloor, and somebody had scrubbed that subfloor in long overlapping strokes with something that had taken the color out of the plywood in stripes. Carson stood in that doorway, and his hands went cold. And I want to be precise about why, because it is the hinge of this entire story. A room emptied by a family looks like a room emptied by a family. Dust bunnies in the corners. The one sock, a crayon under where the dresser was, scuff marks going toward the door. A room emptied by people who are looking for something looks different. The baseboards come off. The closet rod comes down. The carpet gets pulled from the edges inward. Nobody removes a bedroom door off its hinges to move a bed. He was standing in a search, not a move-out. Someone had taken that room apart looking for something, and then had cleaned what they found, and Carson Steadham had spent 11 months learning to tell those two things apart in the dark. He was still standing there when Leona Detmer called his name from the yard. Leona was 74 and had lived across Ridgemont since before Carson bought the house. She was the kind of neighbor who kept a spare key and a spare opinion. She was standing at the edge of his grass in a cardigan with her arms crossed hard over her chest, and when he came out, she didn't say welcome home. She said, "I have been sitting on this for 9 days and it has made me sick." Then she took a folded piece of paper out of her cardigan pocket and held it out at arm's length like it was hot. The paper was a half sheet of lined notebook paper, folded in thirds, with a soft crease that said it had been folded and unfolded a number of times by somebody who kept changing her mind. Geneva's handwriting. He would have known it upside down. It said, "He's better off without a killer for a father. Don't try to find us. Don't make this ugly. Let him have a chance." Carson read it 4 times. Then he turned it over, because that is what you do with a document. And the back was blank except for a faint ghost of pen pressure from a different page that had been written on top of it. He asked Leona when. She said Geneva had knocked on her door on a Tuesday evening, 9 days ago, holding that note, and had said, "If Carson comes back before I call you, give him this and tell him I'm sorry." And Leona had said, "Back from where, honey? He's in Kuwait until September." And Geneva had said, "I know," and had walked back across the road in the rain without an umbrella. Then Leona said the thing that Carson would think about every hour for the next 6 weeks. She said, 2 men came with a box truck the next morning. Not movers. They had a pallet jack and those blue moving blankets, and they took the boys' furniture out first, and then they went back up, and they were up there a long time with a pry bar. And your Walt was sitting in the cab of that truck the whole time in his school clothes, and Carson, he was writing in a notebook. There is a version of Carson Steadham's life where he never leaves Custis County, and none of this happens, and it is worth understanding that version, because the man who walked into that stripped bedroom was built by very specific things. He grew up in Bagwell. His father drove a fuel truck and died of a heart attack at 51 in the cab of it, and what Carson remembered was not the funeral. It was a woman from the fuel company arriving with a cardboard box of his father's things dumped in loose. Sunglasses, a thermos, $311 in a bank envelope. Nobody had written anything down, and when his mother asked twice whether there had been a wedding ring, nobody knew. Carson enlisted at 19 and picked 92 Mike off a list because the recruiter said nobody picks it. He found out on his first deployment why. It is the only job in the Army where the customer is a family that will never meet you and will remember you forever. He was good at it in a way that surprised him. He had a flat, unhurried voice on the phone that made people feel like the ground was holding still. He never once said the words "passed away." because families hear the euphemism and start guessing. He said died. He said we have his things. He said I photographed everything myself. He met Geneva Culliver at a wedding reception in Hopkinsville when he was 31 and she was 28. She was funny in a dry way that took a second to land. She wore a green dress, and she told him within 10 minutes that her family were, in her words, professional vultures, and she said it with a smile that had a little wire in it. That was the truest thing anyone told Carson in his entire adult life, and he took it for a joke. The Cullivers had been in Custis County a long time. Vada Culliver, Geneva's mother, was 68, a small, tidy woman with a helmet of silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she had built a career out of a genuinely good idea that she had rotted from the inside. In the early 90s, Vada started as a volunteer with a senior companion program, driving old people to appointments. She was patient. She was good at paperwork. Judges noticed. When Kentucky, like most states, found itself with more incapacitated adults than families willing to serve, Vada Culliver became something that most people have never heard of and that exists in every county in America: a professional guardian. Here is what that means, and please hold on to it, because this is the machine. If a court decides an adult can no longer manage their own affairs, the court can appoint a guardian to make decisions for that person: where they live, what medical care they get, who is allowed to visit them. And a conservator, often the same person, controls all of their money and property. The person becomes, in the language of the older statutes, a ward. In practical terms, an adult American citizen with a full legal personality on Monday can, on Tuesday, have less control over their own life than a 14-year-old. When there is no family, or when the family is fighting, or when the family is far away, the court appoints a professional. The professional charges the ward's own estate by the hour for doing it. By the time Carson deployed, Vada Culliver was the appointed guardian, conservator, or both for 61 adults across 3 counties. Her son Upton, 44, ran Culliver Estate Services out of a metal building on Trollope Road. Clearouts, estate liquidation. We buy the contents of your home, one call, we handle everything. Upton was loud and likable and wore a company polo with his own face printed on the sleeve, and he had a laugh that filled a room and left nothing in it. And Walton Steadham was 8, and he counted things. Not in a way that worried anybody. He counted steps, ceiling tiles, the fence posts between the house and the mailbox, which was 41. He had a composition notebook with a marbled cover and a $19 disposable film camera that his father had bought him at a drugstore before the deployment, because Carson had told him a rule, and he had told him this rule in the exact flat voice he used on the phone with families. The rule was, if a thing matters, photograph it and write the date. Carson had meant it as a way to keep a kid busy for 11 months. He had meant birthdays, and the dog, and the first day of 3rd grade. He had said it standing in the driveway with his hands on his son's shoulders, and Walt had nodded the way kids nod at instructions, and had then done what almost no adult ever does, which is taken instructions seriously for 11 straight months. The last time Carson saw his son's face before all this, it was on a laptop screen in a plywood booth at a Riffion, 40 seconds of buffering for every 20 seconds of talk. It was the last week of August. Walt was chewing his sleeve. Geneva was somewhere off camera, and there was a sound in the background like a door closing more carefully than doors usually close. Walt said 2 things in that call that Carson replayed later about 1,000 times. The first was, "Dad, how much is 61? Carson had laughed and said, 61 is 61, buddy, why? And Walt had said, no, like, is it a lot? And then, right at the end, when Carson said I love you and be good for your mom, Walt had leaned close to the camera so his face went round and wrong and said, Grandma's houses all smell like cough drops. Carson said, Grandma's house? And Walt said, not her house, her houses. Then the call dropped, and Carson told himself he would ask about it next time. And there was no next time, because the phone stopped connecting 4 days later, and the email account stopped answering. And when he called the house, it rang 11 times and went to a voicemail box that was full. The first 72 hours after Carson Steadham came home were the worst 72 hours of his life, and they were also the hours in which he made the only 2 good decisions available to him. The first decision was made at 9:40 on that first night, standing in his own kitchen with the broken door pane swept into a dustpan. He had his phone in his hand and he was going to call Geneva's mother, and he did not. So instead, he sat down on the folding chair in his empty living room, opened a fresh notebook, and started an inventory. He wrote the date and the time. He wrote the address. He wrote what he had found in each room, item by item, in the same format he used on a personal effects case, because it was the only format his hands knew. He photographed each room from the doorway, then from the center, then each wall. He photographed the new deadbolt. He photographed the scrub marks on Walt's subfloor with his phone flat against the wood so the raking light would show them, because that is how you photograph a surface, not straight down. At 11 that night, he was on his knees, running his fingers along the edge of the subfloor in Walt's room, and he found the loose board. It was the third board from the closet wall, and it had been cut once before, a long time ago, probably for a pipe run, and it lifted out with a screwdriver. The joist bay under it was full of 40 years of insulation dust and one dead wasp, and a photograph. It was a 4x6 drugstore print, curled, face down. It had fallen or been dropped down the gap at the end of the board, and whoever had gone through that room with a pry bar had not gone in that far. Carson turned it over. It was a picture of the inside of a truck bay, taken from a low angle, the way a kid takes a picture. Roll-up door half open, a concrete floor, 4 wooden crates, and behind them a stack of framed pictures wrapped in blue moving blankets, and a rolling rack of clothes, and a chest freezer with a padlock on it. On the wall in the background, a yellow banner with black letters, and the letters that made it into the frame were Culliver Estate. On the white border at the bottom, in pencil, in the careful oversized handwriting of a third grader, House 9. March 3. The lady was still living there. Carson sat on the floor of his son's stripped bedroom for a long time holding that photograph. Then he did the second smart thing. He put the photograph in a Ziploc bag, wrote the date, time, and location on the bag with a marker, photographed the bag, photographed the empty joist bay, put the board back, and wrote the whole sequence in his notebook with times to the minute. Chain of custody. It was the only prayer he knew. At 6:15 the next morning, a Custis County deputy served him at the gate at Fort Campbell with an emergency protective order. Carson read it in the guard shack, while a specialist half his age looked anywhere else. The petition had been filed 9 days earlier, the same day Geneva knocked on Leona's door. The affidavit said that on the 14th of March, during a telephone call, Carson Steadham had told his wife that when he got home he would kill her, and then he would kill their son, and then himself, and that she had been afraid to report it while he was overseas because his unit would protect him. The order prohibited him from coming within 500 feet of Geneva Steadham, or the minor child Walton Steadham. It listed the child's residence as care of Vada Culliver. Carson stood in that guard shack and felt something happen in his chest that he later described as the floor tilting. Because here is the thing about the 14th of March. Carson knew exactly where he had been on the 14th of March, and so did the United States Army, in writing, with signatures. On the 14th of March, Carson Steadham had been at a dignified transfer. He had been standing in the sun on a taxiway for 4 hours and 11 minutes in dress uniform. There had been no phone call, because there could not have been a phone call, because his personal phone had been in a locker in a building 900 meters away, as it was required to be, and there were 16 other people standing in that same line, and a duty log, and a photograph in a newspaper in which he is the third man from the left. He told the JAG captain that at 10 that morning, and the captain wrote it down and then said the sentence that told Carson exactly how much trouble he was in. She said, "That's excellent. It also doesn't matter for 2 to 4 months. Because an emergency protective order is not a verdict. It is a hold. It exists to stop a bad thing that might be about to happen, and it does not care whether the underlying story is true, and the hearing to challenge it was set for a date 5 weeks out, and until then Carson Steadham could not go within 500 feet of his own child." He asked her a question that had been forming in him since the guard shack. He asked, why would somebody file a lie they can only hold for 5 weeks? The captain looked at him for a second and said, because 5 weeks is a long time if you're finishing something. That was the sentence that turned Carson Steadham from a man trying to find his family into a man building a case. He did what he was trained to do, and it looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. He got a room at a motel on the state route with a mini fridge and a desk. He bought a case of file boxes, a label maker, a laser printer, 2 reams of paper, a scanner, and one of those cheap flexible arm lamps. He put butcher paper on the wall over the desk with painter's tape. And he treated the entire situation as a personal effects case with an incomplete manifest, which is a specific thing with a specific procedure, because sometimes containers arrive at a depot with items missing, and it is Carson's literal job to figure out what should be there and is not. Rule 1 of an incomplete manifest: don't start with what you're missing. Start with what you have and make it complete. What he had was one photograph labeled House 9 and a neighbor's memory of a boy writing in a notebook in the cab of a box truck, which meant there were, at minimum, 8 other houses. On the 4th day, he drove to the post office in Bagwell and asked a question that had occurred to him at 3 in the morning. Had anything been returned to that address as undeliverable in the last several months? The clerk, a young guy named Rasco who had gone to school with Carson's brother, went in the back and came out 11 minutes later with a padded envelope, bent at one corner, wrapped in a rubber band with a yellow sticker on it that said, "Return to sender, insufficient address, unable to forward." It was addressed in pencil, in oversized 3rd-grade handwriting, to SFC Carson Steadham, my dad, the Army, Kuwait. There was no unit, no APO, no zip code. A child had gone to a mailbox with a package addressed to the entire country of Kuwait and had put $4.18 worth of stamps on it, which is what a kid guesses when a kid does not know. And the Postal Service of the United States had done exactly what it could do, which was carry it 30 miles, fail to route it, and bring it back to the return address in the top corner, which Walt had also written in pencil, and which was his own house. It had sat in a bin behind the counter for 4 months because the return address had a new deadbolt on it and nobody was answering the door. Carson signed for it in the parking lot and did not open it there. He drove to the motel. He photographed the envelope sealed, front and back, with a ruler beside it. He wrote the time. Then he opened it along the short edge with a knife so the seal stayed intact, and he laid out what was inside on the bedspread in rows. 31 photographs, and a composition notebook with a marbled cover, half full. Carson Steadham had photographed the personal effects of 1,140 dead Americans, and he had never once had to sit down before he could look at something. He sat down. The photographs were a child's photographs, thumbs in the corner, half of a face, a dog, but about 2/3 of them were something else entirely, and it took him 10 minutes to understand what he was looking at, and when he understood it, he said his son's name out loud in an empty motel room. Walt had been photographing houses, not the outsides, the insides, a dining room with all the chairs stacked on the table, a hallway with a wheelchair folded against the wall, a bedroom with a hospital bed in it, and a rolling tray, and a cup with a bendy straw, and in the corner of that frame, out of focus, a woman's hand on a blanket. And on the white border of each print, in pencil, in that careful oversized hand, a house number, a date, and a sentence. House 4, Jan 22. Grandma said don't touch anything. House 6, FEB 9. The man cried. House 7, FEB 19. They took the big clock and the orange chair. House 9, March 3. The lady was still living there. House 11, April 6th. Uncle Upton said, don't write that down. The notebook was worse, and better. Walt had made a table. He had made it the way an 8-year-old makes a table, with a ruler and a lot of erasing, and the columns were house, day, what came out, where it went, who was there. He had filled in 43 rows over 11 months. What came out had entries like 2 rugs, box of army stuff, a flag in a triangle box, sewing machine, 9 pictures of people. Where it went had exactly 3 values, over and over, because Walt was 8 and had noticed that everything went to one of 3 places: barn, truck, dumpster. And who was there had names: Grandma, Uncle Upton, the tall man with the clipboard, Mr. Krebs. At the bottom of the last filled page, in different pencil, pressed hard. I asked Grandma if the people said it was okay, and she said, the people are not able to say. I asked how many people and she said 61. Carson sat on the end of that motel bed until the light through the curtains went orange. His son had been taken along on a job for 11 months, told to sit still, and had done the one thing his father had taught him. He had made a record. He had photographed it and written the date. He had produced, without any idea what he was doing, a contemporaneous field log of 43 property removals, with dates, locations, item categories, disposition, and witnesses. And then he had tried to mail it to the army. And somebody, at some point, had realized the notebook and the camera existed, and had gone into a bedroom with a pry bar and taken the baseboards off. They hadn't found it. It had been in a post office bin the whole time, addressed to a country. It took Carson 11 days to turn 31 photographs into a map, and the way he did it is worth describing, because it is the least glamorous investigative work you will ever hear about, and it is what actually broke this open. He started with what he could match. Kentucky property records are public. Estate and guardianship filings are public. Mostly, though guardianship files are often partly sealed. Auction results are public because auctioneers advertise. Obituaries are public, and the single most useful public record in America, which nobody thinks about, is the County Property Valuation Administrator's website, which will show you a photograph of the outside of almost every house in the county. Walt's photographs were of interiors, but interiors have windows, and windows have views. Carson would take a print, find the window, blow up what was visible through it, and get a shape, a silo, a water tower, a specific curve of guardrail. Then he would spend an evening driving. He found House 9 on the 9th day and sat in his truck across from it for 20 minutes, because House 9 was where the lady was still living there. It was a brick ranch on Farrell Ridge Road, with a wheelchair ramp built out of pressure-treated lumber that had gone gray, and a for sale sign in the yard from a realty office in Hopkinsville, and a lockbox on the door. The mailbox said Boatwright. Eula Boatwright had died 6 weeks after that photograph was taken. Carson found her obituary in 4 minutes. 79 years old. Retired from the school system, 31 years in the cafeteria at Custis County Elementary, which meant she had fed most of the adults in that county when they were 9. Preceded in death by her husband, a Korea veteran. Survived by a nephew, Cleve Boatwright, of Owensboro. Carson called Cleve Boatwright that night and introduced himself and said one sentence, which was, "I think somebody sold your aunt's things while she was still alive, and I have a photograph." There was a silence on that line that went on so long Carson checked the screen. Then Cleve Boatwright said, "I have been calling people about this for 2 years, and you are the first person who has ever called me." They met the next afternoon at a Waffle House off the Parkway, and Cleve brought a grocery bag full of paper, and over 4 hours and a lot of coffee, Carson Steadham learned how the machine actually worked. It went like this. Step 1. Somebody files a petition saying an adult is incapacitated. Anyone can file. A hospital discharge planner, a nursing home worried about a bill, a neighbor, an estranged relative, a lawyer. In Custis County, the petitions were nearly always filed by the office of an attorney named Whitman Hepler, 60 years old, gray suit, 40 years at the same address on Court Street, a man everybody in that courthouse called Whit. Step 2. The court appoints a visitor. In Kentucky, and in a lot of places, before a person can be declared incapacitated, an independent person is supposed to go meet them, interview family, look at where they live, and then write a report for the judge saying what they found. That report is usually 1 to 3 pages. It is the single most important document in the entire process, because judges have crowded dockets, and, in an uncontested case, that report is functionally the whole hearing. In Custis County, the contract court visitor was a man named Donald Yeatman, 52, tall, carried a clipboard. The tall man with the clipboard. Step 3. The judge signs an order. The person becomes a ward. In a plenary guardianship they lose, in one afternoon, the right to decide where they live, who they see, what medical treatment they receive, and what happens to everything they own. Step 4. The guardian, being responsible for the ward's care, decides the ward can no longer live at home. The home is a liability. It has to be sold to fund care. The contents have to be cleared. Step 5. The clear out. And here Cleve Boatwright put a piece of paper on the table between the syrup and the napkins and tapped it with one finger. It was a page from Vada Culliver's annual accounting for the estate of Eula Boatwright, filed with the court, sworn, signed. Under disposition of personal property it said, household contents inspected, no items of appraisable value, contents removed and disposed of, cost of removal, $1,850, paid to Culliver Estate Services. So the estate had paid Upton Culliver $1,850 to take everything to the dump. Cleve put down a second piece of paper. It was a printout of a sale bill from Krebs' auction barn 6 weeks later. Lot 118. Oak dining set, 6 chairs, china service, 2 boxes of ephemera and photographs, a cased American flag, and a Singer treadle machine. Sold, $400. Carson looked at that number for a long time. $400. The estate had paid to have it hauled away as trash, and then it had been sold, and the $400 had gone to a company owned by the family of the woman who had signed the paper saying it was trash. That's not even the part that gets me, Cleve said. Look at what's in Lot 118. Carson looked. A cased American flag. Cleve's uncle had been a machine gunner in Korea and had died in 1998, and that flag had been folded at his graveside and handed to Eula Boatwright with 2 hands by a soldier who was almost certainly younger than Carson had been when he enlisted. And a man in Custis County had put it on a table with a lot number on it and had sold it as part of a group, and the group had brought $400. Carson Steadham had spent 11 months returning the property of the dead to their families with a signature line for every hand that touched it. He put his hands flat on that table so they would stop. Then he asked Cleve Boatwright the question that started the last part of this. He asked, "How many other families are there?" And Cleve said, "I know of 9, but she has 61. There is a moment in every one of these stories where the thing stops being about money. For Carson, it happened on a Tuesday, in the basement records room of the Custis County Courthouse, with a fluorescent tube buzzing over his head, and it happened because of an index. He had been going through guardianship case files for 6 days. Public terminals, a coin-operated copier, a clerk named Ackerman who softened toward him around day 3 and started pulling files before he asked. He had built a spreadsheet. 61 wards, date of petition, petitioner, visitor, date of order, date of home sale, auction date. He was cross-referencing Krebs' sale bills against Culliver accountings, and he had already found 9 matches as clean as Eula Boatwright's, and he had found a 10th that was worse, because in that one the accounting listed a 1966 Ford pickup as scrapped for $200, and the same VIN had sold at Krebs for $9,400. Then he pulled a case number, because it was adjacent to another one, and the caption on the front of the file said, "In re. Carson Dale Steadham, an adult." He thought it was a coincidence of names. He opened it standing up. Petition for appointment of emergency guardian and conservator. Filed by the office of Whitman Hepler, Plake. Filed 4 months and 9 days into his deployment. The petition alleged that Carson Dale Steadham, age 41, was an adult in need of protection by reason of service-connected psychiatric incapacity, that he had made statements indicating an intent to harm himself and others, that he was unable to manage his financial resources, and that his spouse and mother-in-law were prepared to serve. Attached was a report from the court visitor, Donald Yeatman, dated 11 weeks earlier, 3 pages, describing an interview. Describing an interview with Carson. Carson stood in that basement and read 3 pages of an interview that had never happened, with a man who had been 9,000 kilometers away, on a base with a gate log, in a job with a duty roster. Yeatman had written that the respondent presented as guarded and irritable, that the respondent's affect was flat and his insight limited, that the respondent's spouse reported escalating threats. At the bottom, a signature, and a line that said, "Based on personal observation of the respondent." And behind that, an affidavit signed by Geneva Steadham, and behind that, attached as an exhibit, a photocopy of a half-sheet of lined notebook paper in Geneva's handwriting that said, "He's better off without a killer for a father." Carson Steadham finally understood what he was looking at, and it was so much worse and so much simpler than he had let himself imagine. They had not left him. You leave a man you want to be free of. You divorce him. You take the house and you go. They were not leaving him. They were acquiring him. A guardianship over Carson Steadham would have given Vada Culliver control of his army pay, his eventual retirement, his VA benefits, his life insurance beneficiary designations, his house, and, through the guardianship of the person, control of who he was allowed to see and speak to. It would have made him, at 41 years old, in the best physical condition of his life, a ward. A man who cannot sign a contract, cannot hire a lawyer without permission, and whose complaints about his own guardian go to the guardian. That is the elegance of it, and I need you to sit with this for 1 second, because it is the reason this case exists. When a person is under guardianship and says they are being robbed, the system's first assumption is that this is a symptom. The complaint is filed by the guardian. The mail is opened by the guardian. The phone is provided by the guardian. The perfect victim of this scheme is a man that everyone has already been told is dangerous and unwell. The note in Leona Detmer's cardigan pocket was not a goodbye. It was an exhibit. It had been written to be photocopied. And the hearing on the petition was set for the 12th of the following month, 9 days after the hearing on the emergency protective order, which meant the sequence was designed. Get the order first, so he arrives at the guardianship hearing as a man under a protective order for threatening to kill his family. Then he found out where his son was, and that was worse. He found it in the same file, in Vada Culliver's own filing, because they had gotten sloppy in the way that people get sloppy when nobody has ever told them no. In a motion for expenses, Vada had asked the court to approve payment from the Steadham conservatorship, once established, for temporary respite placement of the minor child, Walton Steadham, at Thoresby House. Thoresby House was not a school. It was not a relative's home. Thoresby House was a 22-bed personal care home on Route 9, with a gravel lot and a smoking bench and a wandering alarm on the front door, and 11 of Vada Culliver's 61 wards lived there, and it was owned, through a holding company Carson found in about 4 minutes on the Secretary of State's website, by Vada Culliver. They had parked an 8-year-old boy in a care home for the elderly for the summer. Carson drove out to Route 9 that night. He parked a quarter mile down at a church lot and walked up the tree line in the dark and stood 240 feet away, which he measured later with a wheel because he needed to be able to say it under oath, from the lit windows of the day room. There were 9 or 10 residents in there, in recliners, with a television on, and there was a kid on the floor by the window with a stack of paper, drawing. Walt had gotten taller. He was wearing a shirt Carson didn't recognize. He was drawing with his whole arm, the way he did, and every so often he would look up at the window, not at anything, just up, the way you do when you have been looking up at a door for a long time. Carson stood there for 11 minutes, at 240 feet, with a protective order in his glove box that said 500, and he did the arithmetic, and he understood that if he took 40 more steps toward his own son, he would hand them everything. He went back to the truck and he sat there, and he did not start it for a while. And somewhere in that hour, in a church parking lot on Route 9, Carson Steadham stopped trying to prove he was innocent. Innocent takes months. Innocent takes a hearing and a continuance and another hearing. Innocent was exactly the timeline they had built for. He decided to do something else instead. He decided to make the machine stop. Here is how he found the crack, and it is the single most useful thing in this entire story. So if you take one thing away, take this. Carson went back to the motel and drew a circle on the butcher paper, and around the circle, he wrote every party that touched a Custis County guardianship, and beside each one, he wrote where their money came from. Whitman Hepler, attorney, files the petition. Paid from the ward's estate, on court approval. Donnell Yeatman, court visitor, writes the report. Paid a flat fee per case, from the ward's estate. Vada Culliver, guardian and conservator, paid $95 an hour, from the ward's estate. Upton Culliver, Culliver Estate Services, paid to clear the home, from the ward's estate. Eldon Krebs, auctioneer, paid a commission on the sale and buys back inventory himself at his own sales, which is legal in Kentucky, if disclosed, and was not disclosed. The judge signs. The clerk files. The annual accounting is reviewed by, and this is the part that made Carson laugh out loud in an empty motel room at 1 a.m, the attorney who filed the original petition. Every single arrow in that circle pointed at the same money, the ward's own estate. Everyone in the room was being paid by the person in the room who could not speak. That is a closed loop, and a closed loop cannot be broken from inside, because there is no one inside it who loses anything by keeping it turning. You can send letters, you can call the clerk, you can file a complaint that gets routed to the same 3 people. Cleve Boatwright had been doing exactly that for 2 years and had gotten 9 polite responses. So Carson asked the only question that matters about a closed loop, and it is a question I want you to keep in your pocket for the rest of your life. Who has money at risk in this and is not in this county? He found the answer at 4 a.m. on page 2 of a form. Before a court will let a person hold other people's money, that person usually has to be bonded. A guardian or conservator posts a fiduciary bond, which is an insurance policy written by a surety company that guarantees the ward's estate against the guardian's misconduct. If the guardian steals, the surety pays the ward, and then the surety comes after the guardian for every dime. Vada Culliver's bonds were written by Hartford Indemnity and Surety Company, 61 bonds, aggregate penal sum of $4,600,000, a company in Connecticut. Not from Custis County, not at the church, not at the Rotary, with no relationship to Whit Hepler, no fondness for Vada, and $4.6 million of exposure sitting on top of a scheme they knew nothing about. Carson Steadham looked at that and understood that he was not going to have to beat these people. He was going to have to introduce them to their insurance company. He spent 4 days building the package, and he built it exactly the way he had built 1,140 of them. Not a letter, not an accusation, an inventory. Tab 1, a 1-page cover sheet, no adjectives, listing what was enclosed and how each item was obtained, with dates. Tab 2, the 61 wards, in a table, with case numbers, appointment dates, and bond numbers. Tab 3, 9 matched pairs. On the left, a page of Vada Culliver's sworn annual accounting, saying contents had no appraisable value and were disposed of. On the right, the Krebs auction barn sale bill from the same property, weeks later, with a lot number and a hammer price. He highlighted nothing. He did not need to. Anyone who reads 2 documents can read 2 documents. Tab 4, the 1966 Ford, scrapped for $200, sold for $9,400, with the VIN circled once in pen because that one he circled. Tab 5, 31 photographs, scanned at 600 dots per inch, front and back, with the pencil captions transcribed, and a note that the originals were in the custody of the sender, sealed and photographed, and available. Tab 6, 43 rows from a composition notebook, transcribed exactly as written, including the spelling, because he was not going to clean up his son's spelling. Tab 7, the visitor reports. This one Carson almost did not include, because he had found it late and he could not entirely believe it. He had pulled 31 visitor reports written by Donnell Yeatman over 4 years, and he had laid them side by side on a motel bedspread, and 28 of them contained the identical sentence, word for word, comma for comma. Respondent was unable to state the current date, the name of the president, or the approximate value of her assets, and appeared to lack insight into her deficits. 28 reports, including 4 for men, in which the word her had not been changed. Tab 8, 1 page. In re, Carson Dale Steadham. The 3-page interview report describing personal observation of a man who was, on the stated dates, on a base in Kuwait, with the duty roster and the flight manifest attached, and the newspaper photograph from the 14th of March in which he is the 3rd man from the left. And then a chain of custody sheet, the same form he used at the depot, retyped, with a line for every hand. He addressed it to Clarice Van Meter, Senior Claims Counsel, Fiduciary Bonds, Hartford Indemnity and Surety. He did not mail it. He drove 90 minutes to a shipping store that opened at 8, sent it overnight with signature required, and then, at 11:04 on a Wednesday morning, sitting in his truck in that parking lot, he made the one phone call. It lasted 9 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not say the word fraud. He introduced himself by rank and job title, said that he had come into possession of documents relevant to 61 bonds her company had written in Custis County, Kentucky, that a package was arriving at her desk before 10:30 the following morning, and that he wanted to flag one thing in advance so she could decide whether to open it herself or route it. She asked what the one thing was. He said, "The same $900 worth of household goods appears in two sworn documents. In one, it is worthless and was thrown away. In the other, it was sold. Both documents are signed by your principal." There was a pause on that line, and then Clarice Van Meter, who had been doing this job for 19 years and had spent most of them declining claims from angry relatives, asked him a question that told him he had won. She asked, "How many of the 9 did you match by document, and how many by photograph?" Because that is a question you only ask if you are already thinking about how it will hold up. He said 7 by document, 2 by document and photograph, and 1 more where the vehicle identification number matched. She said, "Sergeant, do not send this to anyone else until I call you back." The package was delivered at 9:58 the next morning. Clarice Van Meter did not call him back for 6 hours, and in those 6 hours, she did the following. She pulled all 61 bond files. She confirmed the aggregate exposure. She sent tab 3 to outside counsel. She had a 19-minute conversation with a vice president in which the phrase "pattern of dishonest acts" was used 4 times, because that is the phrase that turns a surety bond from a piece of paper into a bill. And at 12:40 that afternoon, Hartford Indemnity and Surety Company transmitted to the Custis County District Court, to the Office of the Attorney General of Kentucky, and to the principal, a notice of intent to cancel and demand for immediate accounting on all 61 bonds. I want to explain what that piece of paper does, because Carson did not fully know either. He had understood that it would hurt. He had not understood that it was a hand grenade. A guardian who is required to be bonded and is not bonded is, by operation of law, no longer qualified to serve. The bond is not paperwork. It is the condition of the appointment. When a surety notices cancellation on 61 bonds at once, the clerk of that court has to docket 61 notices, and the court has to set 61 show cause hearings, and the statute requires that notice go out to every interested party of record on every one of those cases. Interested parties of record are the families, all of them, the ones who had been told, for years, that their mother did not want to see them. 61 certified letters went out of the Custis County Clerk's office that afternoon. Carson Steadham was sitting in his truck outside a hardware store in Bagwell when his phone started. The first call came at 2:51 p.m. from a number he did not recognize, and he let it go. The second came at 2:58 from Whitman Hepler's office. The fourth was Upton. The seventh was Thorsby House. The 11th was from a Hopkinsville Realty office, which he found interesting, because it meant a realtor had already heard. By 5:44 that afternoon, 3 hours after the notice went out, Carson Steadham's phone showed 19 missed calls and 11 voicemails, and he had not answered a single one. The 19th call was Geneva. He let it go to voicemail like the rest. She called again 8 minutes later. He let that one go too. At 6:31, he called her back. I have listened to a lot of people describe this conversation, and it is worth telling you that Geneva Steadham did not sound frightened. She sounded furious, in the specific way people get furious when a thing they have always been able to do has stopped working. She said, and this was recorded on his end, legally, in a one-party consent state, "You can't do that to me. You have no idea what you've done. Do you understand that people are calling my mother? You monster." And Carson Steadham, sitting on a folding chair in an empty living room with a legal pad on his knee, said the sentence that ended it. He said, "Geneva, I'm just getting started." She started to say something, and he kept going, flat, unhurried, the same voice he had used on 1,000 phone calls with strangers. He said, "There's a delivery at your mother's house. It came this morning. Go open the garage." The garage on Trollope Road was a detached 3-bay with a gravel apron, and Vada Culliver kept her car in the left bay and 40 years of paper in the right one. At 7:40 that morning, a straight truck with a lift gate had backed up that apron. 2 men had unloaded, onto pallets, 61 bankers' boxes. They had a signed work order. They had been paid in advance, And they were, in one of those details that makes a thing land, employees of a moving company that Upton Culliver had used for 9 years, because they were the only outfit in the county with a lift gate. Each box was labeled on the end, in a black label maker strip, in this format: Boatwright, Eula M., Ward, appointed 03 Nov, died 14 APR, file 1 of 1. And on the lid of each box was a photograph, printed on plain paper and taped down flat. The person. From an obituary, or from a family, or in 11 cases from a photograph Walt had taken. Inside each box, in order, tabbed, the guardian's petition, the visitor's report, the order, the annual accountings, the Culliver Estate Services pull sheet, the Krebs settlement statement, and on top of everything, a chain of custody form with a line for every hand that had touched that person's property, and most of the lines filled in Carson's handwriting. 61 boxes, 61 faces. On the very top box, in a clear sleeve, was a photocopy of 43 rows of a child's composition notebook. And here is why Geneva Steadham started screaming. She did not walk into an empty garage. At 6:15 that evening, 90 minutes before that phone call, the Custis County District Court had entered an emergency order appointing a special fiduciary over all 61 estates, which is what a court does when the guardian is suddenly unbonded and there are 61 people whose bills nobody is paying. The special fiduciary had come out with 2 deputies to secure records. Investigator Carla Hulsey from the Attorney General's Office of Elder Justice was already there, because Clarice Van Meter had sent tab 3 to Frankfurt at 12:41, and the families had come. Because 61 certified letters had gone out at 1 o'clock, and the ones close enough to drive had driven, and by dusk, there were somewhere between 25 and 30 people standing on the gravel apron on Trollope Road. Cleve Boatwright was one of them. Ardis Pickard, whose mother Reba had not been allowed a phone for 2 years, was one of them. A man in his 60s who had brought his own folding chair and would not say a word to anyone was one of them. Nobody was shouting. That was the thing everyone remembered afterward. 30 people stood in a driveway in the dark in near silence, and when the deputy raised that garage door and the light came on over 61 boxes with 61 faces taped to the lids, the only sound was people finding their mother's name. Geneva came out the side door of the house with her phone still in her hand. She got about 4 steps onto the gravel before she understood what she was looking at, and then she turned in a full circle, and then she began screaming for help. Screaming it, over and over, at a driveway that contained 2 uniformed deputies, an investigator from the Attorney General's office, a court-appointed fiduciary, and 30 people holding certified letters. The deputies did not move. One of them said, later, in a deposition, the flattest sentence in this entire story: "Ma'am, I'm right here. What's the emergency?" It took 11 months to finish, which Carson noted, because he notices numbers, was exactly the length of his deployment. The emergency protective order against him was dissolved 9 days later, and Judge Wilmer Krager did something judges very rarely do. He made a written finding that the petition was knowingly false, and he read the 14th of March into the record himself. The duty roster, the flight manifest, the photograph from the newspaper, third man from the left, standing in the sun for 4 hours and 11 minutes while a flag-draped transfer case came down a ramp. The guardianship petition against Carson was dismissed with prejudice on the same afternoon. Whitman Hepler did not appear. His associate did, and asked to withdraw, and did not make eye contact with anybody in the room. Donnell Yeatman, the tall man with the clipboard, folded fastest and hardest, the way people do when the evidence against them is their own filing cabinet. 28 identical reports. He pled to 61 counts of second-degree perjury and 1 count of criminal facilitation, and was sentenced to 8 years, and the sentence everyone in the county remembers is the one Judge Krager said to him at sentencing: "You were the only step in this process that existed to protect them. You were the door. You charged $300 to leave it open." Vada Culliver went to trial because she genuinely believed, up until the 2nd week, that a jury in Custis County would see a small, tidy church-going woman in reading glasses on a beaded chain and not a predator. The Commonwealth put on 22 witnesses. It put on Clarice Van Meter, who explained bonds to a jury with a patience that made the whole room lean in. It put on Eldon Krebs, who took a deal and sat in that box for a day and a half and explained, in the voice of a man who had known for years, what a lot number is. It put on 9 families. And on the 4th day the Commonwealth put on an exhibit that the defense fought harder than any other. A photograph of a hospital bed in a brick ranch on Farrell Ridge Road, taken from a low angle by a child, with a woman's hand visible on the blanket, and on the white border in pencil, House 9. March 3. The lady was still living there. Vada Culliver was convicted on 34 counts. Exploitation of an adult, theft by failure to make required disposition, perjury, and 1 count that took a special prosecutor to build. Knowing exploitation resulting in the death of an adult, for Eula Boatwright, who had been moved out of Thorsby House to a cheaper facility 90 miles away, 11 days after her home sold, against the written recommendation of her own physician, Dr. Ludella Rasko, whose evaluations Vada had stopped requesting 3 years earlier, because Dr. Rasko kept finding people capable. Eula died 19 days after that transfer. She was 79. She had fed most of that county lunch. Vada Culliver was sentenced to 28 years. Upton Culliver took a plea and got 11 years. Whitman Hepler surrendered his law license before his disciplinary hearing and was disbarred. Geneva Steadham pled guilty to perjury and to filing a false report, and to 1 count of complicity. She got 4 years, with 2 to serve. The custody order that came out of it gave Carson sole custody and gave her supervised visitation, contingent on completing a program, and she has completed part of it. I am told that the moment she asks about, still, is not the courtroom. It's the driveway. It's the garage door going up. Walt came home on a Thursday. Carson had gotten the house back by then and had put the room together first, before anything else, before he had a bed of his own. He replaced the floorboards. He put the closet door back on its hinges and the shelf back on the wall with the same laser level, and he did not tell his son that he had done any of it, because Walt walked in and looked at the shelf and said, "You used the level," and Carson said, "Yeah," and that was the whole conversation. The Boatwright flag came back. That is a real thing that happened, and it took 9 months. Krebs's records showed Lot 118 had gone to a picker out of Nashville, who had split it, and the flag in its triangular case had sat in a booth in an antique mall in Dixon, Tennessee for 211 days with a price tag of $22 on it. Carson drove down and bought it and did not argue about the price, and drove it to Owensboro, and he did not hand it to Cleve Boatwright at the door like a package. He carried it in with both hands the way he had been trained to, and he said the words, and Cleve Boatwright, who was 58 years old, sat down on his own porch step. 41 items from 9 estates were recovered and returned. Carson did every one of them personally, with a chain of custody form, on his own time. He is still in. He put in 4 and got a slot teaching at the Mortuary Affairs School, and he lives in Bagwell and drives it. And once a month he does something the county now formally calls, in an administrative order signed by Judge Krager, the Independent Inventory Program. Before any guardian in Custis County may dispose of the contents of a ward's home, a volunteer goes to that house with a camera and a form, photographs every room, and files it with the court. There are 9 volunteers now. The first one to sign up was Cleve Boatwright, and on the second Saturday of most months there is a kid at those inventories, 12 now, taller, who does the photography because he is faster than the adults and better at it, and who has never once had to be told the rule. If a thing matters, photograph it and write the date. I've been sitting on this one for a while, and I want to be careful with the takeaway, because the obvious one is wrong. The obvious takeaway is that Carson Steadham won because he was a soldier. He didn't. Almost nothing he did in this story required a uniform. He read public records in a basement. He drove around looking at silos through windows. He put 2 pieces of paper side by side. What he actually had was a professional habit that most of us have been trained out of. He wrote things down at the time, with dates, without knowing yet what they meant. That's it. That's the whole superpower. His son had the same habit for 11 months because a man in a driveway told him a rule and then got on a plane, and a 3rd grader's pencil captions ended up in front of a jury. But the thing I actually want to hand you is the question, because that question works everywhere. When something feels rigged and you can't tell why, don't ask who's lying. Ask this instead. Who is getting paid here, and who is paying them? Draw the circle. In this case, every single person in the room, the lawyer who filed, the investigator who evaluated, the guardian who decided, the company that hauled, the auctioneer who sold, and the lawyer who then reviewed it all, was paid out of the pocket of the one person in the room who was not allowed to speak. That is not corruption. That is a design. And then ask the follow-up, which is the one that actually breaks things open. Who has real money at risk in this and does not live here? A surety company, an insurer, a lender, a licensing board in the state capital, a federal grant administrator. There is almost always somebody outside the loop, and they don't know your neighbors, and they don't care about the rotary, and if you hand them a clean, boring, unemotional inventory of documents, they will move faster than any of the people you have been begging for 2 years. Cleve Boatwright wrote 9 complaint letters full of grief and got 9 polite responses. Carson Steadham sent 1 envelope with no adjectives in it, and 61 bonds were canceled in 96 minutes. Grief is not evidence. A table is evidence. So, if there is somebody in your life who has gone quiet, an aunt whose phone number stopped working, a neighbor who used to come to the fence, a parent whose new care coordinator says now isn't a good time, again, go knock. Today, not this weekend. And if you get told no by somebody who is being paid by that person's money, write down the date and the name and the exact words they used. You will probably never need it. Eula Boatwright needed somebody to have it, and for 2 years nobody did.